Welcome back to Masterpiece Theater. I'm Alistair Cook. As you will recall, in our last episode, we learned about hormones. How do hormones work? How do hormones regulate events throughout the body? How is it ultimately under the control of your hypothalamus? How your brain, thus, has a capacity to regulate events everywhere, not only through the autonomic nervous system, but also through the hormonal end, the different classes of hormones, how hormone receptors work, very complicated crosstalk between different endocrine, different hormonal systems. All of this was a precursor for today's topic, which is to now look at how do hormones affect your brain. This is, in a sense, completing a circle. What we saw as a theme over and over in the last lecture, your brain regulates your pituitary, regulates your peripheral gland, and eventually you get the right levels of hormones in the bloodstream. What we look at today is closing that circle, how hormones in turn can get into your brain. And hormones can affect all sorts of neurological functions, ones especially relevant to us here, ones having to do with behavior and mood and memory and emotions and all those things. And you guessed it, of course, a theme throughout, which we will look at in more detail at the end. We differ, each of us, in how readily hormones do this. How much of the hormones we secrete, how readily they get into the brain, the sensitivity of different parts of our brains to these hormones, more as part of this process of defining what makes us individuals. Okay, this field can essentially be called behavioral neuroendocrinology. Neuroendocrinology, the interactions between hormones and the brain, and we saw in the last lecture one variant of neuroendocrinology, the fact that your brain, your hypothalamus, is regulating an awful lot of hormonal release, that business about your brain being an endocrine gland. That is one aspect of neuroendocrinology. In this lecture, looking at, and closing the circle, the other end, the behavioral aspects that these hormones in turn affect neurological function. And this has been known for a long time. This is probably the oldest fact known in neuroendocrinology. This is probably the oldest fact known in endocrinology, that certain hormones affect certain aspects of behavior. This harks back to that classic experiment in neuroendocrinology done probably 10 or 20,000 years ago, where some Paleolithic guy chased around his backyard one time too many by a bull there, got a bunch of the neighbors together, wrestled down the bull, castrated him, and discovered when you get rid of the testes, males become a lot more manageable at that point. Something or other coming out of the testes has something or other to do with why such a disproportionate percentage of Earth's violence is driven by males. Something in the testes affects something going on in the brain. That first rather crude experiment in neuroendocrinology and behavioral endocrinology showing hormones affect behavior. And that theme has simply been hammered in over and over again in the years since. Hormones can do all sorts of ways in which we view the world and sense the world and respond to them and so on. We've heard one example of this already, and this was 3 or 4 lectures ago looking at LTP, long-term potentiation, when we began to look at modulators of LTP, how readily you cause LTP, how readily you strengthen a synapse. Alcohol makes things worse. Nutrition helps things in the opposite direction. We saw a neuroendocrine feature to that story. Back to those glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids, we now know, steroid hormones, glucocorticoids coming out of your adrenal gland in response to stress. Get chased by the lion, you turn on the sympathetic nervous system, you in addition secrete glucocorticoids. We know some of the hormones from the last lecture as well. You also secrete beta endorphin and prolactin. We're beginning to get a sense of the endocrinology, the stress response. Glucocorticoids are an important part of it. We know this already. We know already that glucocorticoids get into the brain. They get into the brain where they bind to glucocorticoid receptors sitting in the hippocampus. And what we heard in that lecture was that very important inverse U property, going from no stress to moderate amounts of stress, and it's glucocorticoids that make LTP work better. You file memories away better. You go from moderate amounts to severe amounts of stress, and you disrupt LTP. That's understood on the cellular level these days, exactly how does this hormone do this, and this is sorted out, this is understood perfectly well. What's the logic of this, though? Moderate amounts of stress and your memory works better, that phenomenon we all know where we were when Kennedy was shot. We've heard this already. Massive amounts of stress and you disrupt memory formation. Why should your hippocampus be so sensitive to glucocorticoids? because that is the case. This is the part of the brain which is most sensitive to glucocorticoids. We could probably translate that into a cellular fact by now. This is the part of the brain where neurons have amongst the highest levels of receptors for glucocorticoids. That's where the sensitivity comes from. Why should this be? Why should the part of your brain which is sensitive to forming which is sensitive to forming memories, why should this part of the brain be sensitive to stress? This makes perfect sense. We don't automatically memorize everything we encounter. We don't more automatically memorize and file away everything. Instead, in us, memory is very much a function of how important the circumstances are. If it's a major event, we will file stuff away and remember it forever. We can't remember where we were 24 hours before, whatever the crisis was, but that crisis we remember forever. We need to have a mechanism saying, this is a big thing, stick it away. Remember this, learn how this happened, try to remember next time, uh-oh, this looks like it's occurring again. This is what learning is about. You learn the important stuff. Your hippocampus has to have a mechanism for knowing this is an important event, this is a trivial one, this one you do LTP for. That's why moderate levels of glucocorticoids in the moderate stress range, why that makes sense that should help ATP. Why is it that massive amounts of stress and we often shut down LTP? Why is it that concentration becomes awful at that point? We see that phenomenon. People who go through horrible traumatic stressors often block out the memory of it. Traumatic amnesia, people who see their loved ones killed in front of them in some horrible accident, often people won't remember the details of it. That is this, I don't know how better to describe it, but a wonderfully compassionate feature of our neurobiology. Extreme traumas, there's no lesson you were going to learn from that. There's no way you're going to come away from that saying, that's something I have to remember to avoid that next time. Massive, unspeakable stressors, and you don't necessarily want to remember it. It's a very nice, logical piece of our wiring that moderate stressors, that enhances memory formation, extreme, severe, sustained stressors, and we don't remember as well. Glucocorticoids doing that. So that is our first example, a hormone that affects very dramatically how one part of our brain works. A second example, and this one having to do with sex hormones. I show here a reflex that is well understood amongst all of you out there who know the personal lives of female rats and hamsters and guinea pigs in a great amount of detail. We see here the famed lordosis reflex. Here is a satellite photograph of a rat undergoing a lordosis reflex, going from the upper left corner to the lower right, and you will notice the smile appearing on this female rat's face. What goes on in the lordosis reflex is you stick your tail up in the air. What is that about? You go from the process of your having your tail down to arching your back, forming a lordotic arch in your back. If you happen to be a rat or a hamster or a guinea pig, you undergo a lordotic reflex if you're female, sticking your tail up in the air. What you thereby do is expose your genitals to the male who has stimulated you to have that lordotic reflex. And thanks to that lordotic reflex, you are now more likely to mate successfully and leave copies of your genes for future generations. The lordotic reflex is this genetic program in female rats and other rodents to increase the likelihood of reproducing. That's great. The interesting thing about the lordosis reflex is it doesn't happen all the time. The lordotic reflex, or lordosis reflex in either case, it's stimulated by pressing on the flanks of a female rat or hamster, etc. Press on the flanks and up goes the tail. When are flanks pressed on? That's exactly what the male rodents are intent on doing, and they manage to press on the flanks, up goes the tail, but not all the time. Only if the female is ovulating that day. Only if she has certain estrogen levels in her bloodstream. Estrogen modulates that reflex. What's the logic of that? That's perfectly straightforward. It makes no sense at all to go through this lordotic reflex, and she has no interest in that male whatsoever if she's not ovulating that day. This is part of the timing, the synchrony between ovarian events and behavioral events, and the fact that in most species, animals are sexually active only around the time of ovulation. It's a bizarre human specialty to have sex the rest of the time. In most species, there's this very tight coordination between the physiology of reproduction, the behavior of reproduction. Female rodents have lordosis reflexes only if they have enough estrogen in their bloodstream. This is a very weird reflex. I mean, you sit there in the doctor's office and the doctor taps on your knee, and it's not that your knee flips out only in certain times in the month, that sort of thing. That reflex is always there. The vast majority of the reflexes we're accustomed to work all the time. This is a reflex that's hormone dependent. Estrogen regulates the relevant neurons there. Estrogen causes that reflex to occur only on certain occasions. How would we wire this up? Simple. We know exactly how that's going to work by now. And this we learned in the very first lecture. Back to the axon hillock. The axon hillock, and what we have here is, suppose this is a neuron that's relevant to a lordosis reflex. This is a neuron that's helping contract the muscles, causing the back to make a lordotic arching. And what we have here is estrogen entering this neuron, binding to an estrogen receptor, which goes to the DNA, that happens to be the way that estrogen works, goes to the DNA, turns on a gene, which makes a protein, and this protein goes to the axon hillock. And this protein makes the axon hillock more jumpy, more excitable. We know exactly what that term means from the first lecture. An axon hillock that's more excitable. Now, instead of that neuron requiring 9,000 inputs all at once saying, yes, get excited, it requires only 2,000. If it requires 9,000, no male hamster on Earth is ever going to stimulate the flanks enough to actually cause a lordosis reflex. Shift down to the 2,000 threshold on an ovulatory day, and the slightest stimulation there, and you've got a lordotic reflex. Wonderful, interesting reflex in that this is hormone-driven, and what's most striking by now is we know how to build a circuit that works that way. All you have to do is play around with the axon hillock, and that might very well be how that's working. By now, we can see plausible mechanisms to explain on a cellular level this whole physiological reflex that makes mating more likely to work. Do we humans have lordotic reflexes? I personally don't, and very few humans do, but we have another feature of the system that bears some resemblance to it. Our skin is more sensitive to stimulation at certain times. And by this, I don't mean just any old skin, to stimulate this part of your body, and we know how those tactile receptors work by now, and the lateral inhibition, all that sort of stuff. It turns out that our tactile receptors in our genital skin get more sensitive at certain times. And if you don't have a lot of estrogen floating around if you were female, if you don't have a lot of testosterone floating around if you were male, that skin is less sensitive. The sensitivity of that skin to stimulation fluctuates over the course of the cycle, fluctuates over life history, and exactly the sort of wiring. This is nothing as dramatic as huge reflexes only at certain times in the month. We can speak Latin out of some sort of reflex. Nothing that fancy or extreme, just subtle stuff. You're just lowering the threshold for those cells to respond at certain times of the cycle, at certain times of life, and we know exactly how we would wire that as well. It's got to be some kind of trick with the axon hillock and those neurons, or the number of receptors, or the amount of neurotransmitter. We'd have no problem designing that by now. And we'd have no problem designing why some people are more sensitive in that way than others. This makes perfect sense. So we've got the second example, the ways in which sex hormones can regulate the sensitivity of these sensory receptors. Okay, this is one dealing with the peripheral nervous system. This is your neurons sitting out in your skin, spinal cord neurons. We shift now to a case in behavioral neuroendocrinology, a case where we're using neurons that are right in the very heart of the brain. Insofar as your brain has a heart, looking at the very center of this, rather than at the periphery, looking at what testosterone, what male sex hormones have to do with aggression. This is no mere academic subject. As we all know, a highly disproportionate percentage of violence on this planet is driven by males in species after species, and this is real problematic. And this is not just because males have, greater muscle mass, and thus males are much better at doing physical violence. Males are better at doing physical violence, but males are better at violence and more prolific at it, that violence that involves you pushing a button, or looking the other way, or pulling a trigger, or things that don't involve a whole lot of muscle. The gender difference in aggression probably has very little to do with muscle mass. What it probably has to do with is something, in part, something having to do with the effects of testosterone in the central nervous system, testosterone in the brain. There's a general correlation. Males tend to be more aggressive than females in species after species. Males tend to have higher levels of male sex hormones than females do. This sounds like rather straightforward, and why don't I just say males, aggression, and androgens go together? There's at least one bizarre exception out there in the animal kingdom. This is the spotted hyena. And we're going to have a 30-second spotted hyena digression here. Spotted hyenas show this bizarre sex reversal system. Among spotted hyenas, females are socially dominant to males. Females are more aggressive than males. Females generally have greater body mass, greater muscle mass. Females typically have higher levels of male sex hormones than male hyenas do. A weird sex reversal system, and this is fascinating stuff, and as we speak, there's scientists using your tax dollars out in Berkeley to study this and trying to sort this out because it's a fascinating story. This is a weirdo side aspect in the animal kingdom. For the most part, though, males have more sex hormones, more male sex hormones than females do, and they're more aggressive. Okay, so that's the first correlation, suggesting testosterone has something to do with aggressive behavior. You can show that more clearly rather than just a correlation. These things tend to go together. You know, testosterone levels rise at certain times of the year in certain males of certain species that are seasonal maters, and that's when aggression goes up. Testosterone levels tend to rise at puberty. That's when aggression goes up as well. This still is correlative. How can you prove testosterone has something to do with it? Take away the testosterone and levels of aggression go down. That classic old experiment we already heard about in neuroendocrinology, castration reduces aggression in species after species. What that proves to you in this what's called a classical subtraction experiment, take a hormone away, and if a behavior changes at that point, that hormone's got something to do with that behavior. What you've just proved is testosterone has something or other to do with aggression. Does this mean that testosterone causes aggression? That's a much more subtle question, and there's very little reason to think testosterone causes aggression. It does something much more interesting than that. And to get a sense of that, we need to look at an area of the brain that's very relevant to aggression. Back to our limbic system, the limbic system from the previous lectures, limbic system, emotion, lust, seasonal mating, rage, all of that. This is the part of the brain that's very relevant to aggression. And there's a subsection of it called the amygdala. Amygdala is very involved in aggression. What's the evidence for that? If you experimentally stimulate an animal's amygdala, you can have a massive outburst of aggression. Okay. If you experimentally destroy an animal's amygdala, you greatly reduce aggression. Interesting human variants on it. During the 1970s, there was a wildly controversial surgical procedure where, in a number of intractably violent humans, surgeons went in and destroyed the amygdala of these people. And these were court-ordered procedures, and these were enormously controversial. Number one, whether the science was justified, and two, even if the science worked, should we be doing anything like this? And this harked back to all the debates about the very incredible abuses with prefrontal lobotomies, things of that sort. Tremendously controversial. What the data seemed to show was, in a subset of individuals, aggression did go down. Also, in horrifying documented cases, these were done to individuals where nothing justified this going on. That's a very interesting chapter in neurobiology and a very disturbing one. In terms of the science, though, many of these studies showed that, yes, indeed, the amygdala is involved in aggression. Other variants of this, if you stimulate the amygdala in a human, you get an aggressive outburst. And this is seen very rarely in an extremely rare subtype of epilepsy where the epileptic seizure is started in the amygdala. And I note how rare this is because there's an awful historical precedent for viewing epileptics as being violent individuals because they flail around during a seizure. This is century-old view. This is back to epileptics being burned at the stakes. Horrifying history with this disease. So touch on this very lightly. There's a rare subtype where the seizure begins in the amygdala, and often these people have violent outbursts just beforehand. The amygdala has something to do with aggression. What does the amygdala talk to in the brain? Where does it send a lot of its axons? You guessed it, the hypothalamus. Get into a rage and your heart speeds up. That may have something to do with the amygdala stimulating sympathetic outflow from the hypothalamus. There's connections there. So where does testosterone come in? As you might expect, the amygdala has tons of receptors for testosterone. It's very sensitive to testosterone. We now ask a question, what does testosterone do to the function of these neurons? Does testosterone get into the amygdala and cause these neurons to have action potentials and suddenly you're feeling rageful about things you weren't before? That's not how it works. What you see here is a schematic demonstration of this. What I just described is if you've got an amygdaloid neuron that's not having action potentials and you throw in some testosterone now, you're not going to give it action potentials. That's not what happens. What occurs is shown on the right instead. Here we have an amygdaloid neuron that's having an action potential every now and then. If and only if it's already having this pattern, what testosterone does is increase the frequency of the action potentials. You want a metaphor for this? This is not that testosterone goes in and turns on some radio that starts playing loud martial music and before you know it, people are goose-stepping all over the place. If the radio is already on, testosterone turns up the volume. Testosterone does not cause aggression so much as it modulates it. Testosterone does not cause action potentials in neurons. It makes neurons more excitable to stimuli. And we know this in all sorts of ways. Testosterone doesn't necessarily make an individual more aggressive. It makes them more readily provoked by some external stimulus. And you can see this in a more sort of integrative study as well. This was a study done a few years ago where somebody had 5 rhesus monkeys, 5 male rhesus monkeys in a social group, and you know, you get a dominance hierarchy, and there's a number 1 and a 3 and a 5, and number 1 rules it over the other ones, certain amount of aggression. The researchers went in and they gave number 3 in the hierarchy a tremendous amount of testosterone. Enough testosterone to make that individual more aggressive. Did that mean that number 3 was now beating up on number 2 and number 1 and shifting the hierarchy? Not at all. That never happened. All that occurred now was number 3 was 10 times worse of a misery to numbers 4 and 5. You weren't creating new patterns of aggression, you were exaggerating pre-existing patterns. Testosterone does not cause aggression on a cellular level, it seems to exacerbate pre-existing patterns. And that's a real important point in terms of understanding the biology of the system. I think it's also important in understanding and trying to make judgments about when aggression occurs. There's very little reason to think that aggression can be caused by levels of one hormone. We're more complicated than that. A way of seeing that is then looking at testosterone levels in us as individuals. And this is this issue, again, we keep coming back to our individual differences. Take some guy and decreases testosterone levels down to 0 after castration, and yes, indeed, levels of aggression go down. Take some guy and give him massively elevated levels of testosterone, and that's what you often see in weightlifters who are abusing anabolic steroids. That's another term for androgens, testosterone. These guys who are taking anabolic steroids boost their levels high enough, way higher than you normally get in the bloodstream, and yes, indeed, these folks become more aggressive. That's pathology, though. Those are abnormal levels. Look at a normal collection of males and look at their individual differences in testosterone levels. Is that going to tell you who's going to be the most aggressive one there? Look at one individual guy and look at his testosterone levels over the course of weeks or months, and if today he's got 8% more testosterone in his bloodstream than he did last week, is he more likely to be aggressive today? A million studies have been done looking at this, and the answer seems to be these little individual differences don't make a difference. There's no way little hiccups in terms of how much testosterone you secrete into the bloodstream or get into your brain or get to the amygdala is going to explain why some people want to watch boxing matches on TV and other people find that to be repulsive, why some person tends to get into arguments and the other person doesn't. It can't explain it on that level. Get anywhere from 10 or 20% of normal levels up to twice as high as normal levels, and everything's roughly the same within there. Get lower than that, castration level, aggression goes down. Get higher than that, weightlifters stoked on anabolic steroids, you get aggressive there, but within the normal range, individual differences don't seem to make a difference. Another realm where you get that same punchline, individual differences in testosterone levels seem to have nothing to do with male sexual behavior either. Knock things all the way down, sexual interest disappears. Raise things through the roof, sexual interest increases. Within the normative range, though, individual differences don't make a difference. They don't make a difference in terms of interest in sex, frequency of it, things of that sort, nor do they make a difference in who you find to be sexually interesting. Sexual orientation, a million studies have been done over the years with the tacit guess that something is going to be different, read that something is going to be wrong, with the endocrine picture of men who are homosexual. Gay men are going to have something different, something wrong with their testosterone levels, and a million studies later, there's essentially no evidence for that. And essentially no evidence for gay women either. The amount of testosterone, estrogen, progesterone seems to have very little to do within the normative range with sexual interest, sexual drive, and who you aim that at in humans. Very interesting lesson. These hormones modulate the systems, but they are not controlling things, and not in these very delicate, subtle sorts of ways. So that's an important cautionary note. Okay, let's switch to another way in which hormonal events in your body can affect your brain and behavior. And this is a rather unlikely outpost. This is one that was discovered relatively recently, to your gut. Your gut is not one of the endocrine glands we've spent a lot of time thinking about. Nevertheless, your gut, your stomach, your pancreas, your gallbladder, your intestines, they're producing all sorts of hormones that are shuttling up and down the tubes there, telling you when to release enzymes, when to stop hydrochloric acid release, when to churn, when to open up passageways, sphincter muscles, things of that sort. Inside your GI tract, your gastrointestinal tract, it's this cauldron of hormones shuttling all sorts of information around all over the place. That's great. That's how your GI tract goes and does its business. Interestingly, it turns out that some of those hormones of your GI tract can get into your general circulation, where they can get into your brain and affect things. Here's the hormone that has the most interesting implications with this, a hormone called CCK, cholecystokinin. Don't even think of writing that one down. CCK is a hormone that you secrete around the border between your stomach and your small intestines, and CCK is basically, roughly, a hormone that is secreted when you're almost done with digestion, when you're just about to dump a whole bunch of nutrients from your intestines into your circulation. It tends to be secreted when you've broken down your proteins and they're about to turn into amino acids, when you've broken down your fat into its building blocks. CCK is a signal that you've pretty much done your job with digestion. So if CCK percolates into your bloodstream and gets into your brain, number one, what signal is it going to tell your brain? What's its behavioral effect going to be? And number two, where is it going to have that effect? You can guess this by now. Number one, what are the effects of CCK on the brain? This is the hormone that tells you you're okay, you've had plenty to eat. Stop feeling hungry. Stop feeling hungry. It's a satiation signal. Where it's going to have its effects, you betcha, in the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus with lots of CCK receptors. CCK is the signal from the folks down in the boiler room saying, yes, we've almost finished and you're about to get a whole load of amino acids and fat and glycerol and sugars dumped into your bloodstream. Forget about feeding. You feel okay right now. CCK mediates satiety, satiation. And you can bet likewise that there's a billion scientists out there chained to their benches trying to figure out ways of making CCKs that could be used as drugs to decrease appetite, diet pills, things of that sort. And as we well know, if those folks succeed, they are going to become very famous and be carried around on sedan chairs, because we will spend a fortune on diet pills like that. CCK working in the hypothalamus, giving a signal, we've just done our job down there. Very interesting stuff. Another class of hormones that get into the brain and affect behavior. And these are ones that are very relevant for at least half of the folks listening to this, and very relevant for understanding certain aspects of abnormal behaviors and mental diseases. What do ovarian hormones have to do with behavior? Estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone are secreted in dramatically varying levels depending on where you are in your menstrual cycle. For a rodent, where you are in your estrous cycle. For a primate, likewise, where you are at different points. Thousand-fold differences in these hormones, depending on if you're cycling, if you're pregnant, if you're giving birth, if you're going through menopause, if you're prepubescent. Dramatically different levels of these hormones. Even more dramatically are the changes in the ratios of estrogen and progesterone. And that turns out to be very important as well. Estrogen gets into the brain. Progesterone gets into the brain. Both of them are particularly good at affecting events in, you guessed it, of course, the limbic system. Limbic system neurons have lots of receptors for estrogen and progesterone, and there's lots of information out there about what they do. They regulate neurotransmitter synthesis. They regulate the levels of receptors for neurotransmitters. They regulate the level of the enzymes that break down neurotransmitters. As we saw already, there's reasons to think estrogen might be able to do things to axon hillox. Essentially, these two hormones can regulate everything you can think of in your limbic system. And the general picture is, in this regulation, is it's not so much the amount of estrogen or the amount of progesterone, the ratio of the two. Now, why is this interesting? Okay, what we've just established is you can almost do any old thing you want to in the limbic system by playing around with estrogen-progesterone ratios. This is real relevant. This is relevant in two different realms. The first one being depression. Depression, as we know already, is a neurochemical disorder, and we've gotten some sense of which neurotransmitters there may be abnormal levels of, as we saw with Prozac blocking the reuptake of serotonin, norepinephrine. If you block the reuptake and a depressive person feels better, aha, maybe there's not enough serotonin or norepinephrine around normally. We've got some evidence on that neurochemical level. We by now have some evidence of what this disease is about on a neuroanatomical level, that business about the cortex thinking of sad thoughts, telling it to your hypothalamus, cut those connections. Sometimes people feel better, and what you get then is some evidence that there's a cortical input into the limbic system, the hypothalamus. We're beginning to get a sense of the workings of this. When you look at sex differences in the patterns of depression, what you realize is hormones make a difference as well. Women have much higher rates of one type of depression than do men. Generally, there's two different broad classes of depression. There's depression where you fluctuate between feeling okay and feeling depressed. Feeling okay and feeling depressed, what would be called a single pole, a unipolar depression. In contrast, there's this other subtype of depression where people fluctuate between being wildly excitable, going a mile a minute, not sleeping, not eating for days, thought-disordered, grandiose, destructive gestures, crash down into a depression, go back the other way, back and forth. Two poles, bipolar depression, also known as manic depressive disorder. Men and women have almost identical rates of manic depression in society after society. Unipolar depression, women have much higher rates than do men. Not only that, but women are far more likely to get their depressions at certain points in their reproductive life histories, around the time of their periods, around the time that they're giving birth, around the time that they're going through menopause. The 2 weeks after which a woman is given birth, the 2-week post-parturition period, is in fact the most vulnerable time in the life of a human for succumbing to a major depressive disorder. What that often does, that pattern, is it suggests to somebody there's something biological going on here. There's all sorts of theories out there as to why women have higher rates of depression than men do. There's psychosocial explanations having to do with degrees of control that people have in different social settings. There's cognitive theories about different ways in which, on the average, women and men deal with emotionally upsetting situations cognitively. For my money, the most interesting thing is this endocrine link. If you were getting more depressions around the time that you were getting very dramatic changes in estrogen and progesterone levels, that's a hint. And what you see is estrogen-progesterone ratios have an awfully striking capacity to regulate serotonin levels and norepinephrine levels and all these things that seem to have something to do with depression going on in the limbic system. It's very poorly understood at this stage, but there's a lot of people convinced out there that these hormones have a lot to do with that pattern. In certain individuals, certain people with either a tendency to get the hormone levels a little bit off at certain times, or who have a particular neurochemical vulnerability to little glitches in the regulation. So that's one way in which estrogen and progesterone might be relevant to behavior. The second way is aggression. Very interesting pattern. A number of studies have shown that a highly statistically disproportionate percentage of violent crimes that are committed by women are committed a couple of days before these women have their periods. during the premenstrual period. And we look here at this issue of PMS, premenstrual syndrome. And this used to be a very controversial subject. It's somewhat less so now. PMS appears to be a very real biological disorder. This is not that, a large percentage of women get a certain pattern of mood shifts just before their periods. A subset of women have very severe mood shifts at that time, and they get labeled as having this premenstrual syndrome, and it basically has two components of symptoms. One is an axis of depressive symptoms, as we just heard about. The other one is irritability and aggression and things of that sort, and a variety of these studies showing, looking, for example, at women incarcerated for violent crimes, a disproportionate percentage of them committed their crimes shortly before their periods. And back to that first lecture and those 4 features that popped up that have been used in courts of law to defend people against murder, at least in one case in a courtroom in England, a woman who had murdered her husband, I think the day before her period, was acquitted on the argument that she suffered from severe PMS, and the argument was made there that this was not something she had a whole lot of control over. Very interesting in that regard. Again, one would expect estrogen and progesterone to do interesting things to your amygdala, things of that sort, and there's the evidence for that. This whole subject of PMS has been fascinating in recent years in that one would, searching for explanations for this phenomenon, expect there will be psychological theories, psychodynamic ones, anthropological ones, all sorts of different versions that have popped up over the years as to what is PMS, is it for real, biologically, what causes it. Very interestingly, there's a number of studies that suggest that even non-human primates may have something that vaguely resembles PMS, and if a non-human primate has something like that, you're not looking at a purely cultural phenomenon, we're looking at something biological again, one that may well be modulated by cultural factors, but there seems to be a biological component. Okay, what this has given us now is a little bit of a tour of different endocrine systems and the ways in which they can regulate our behavior. And our theme, of course, now is shifting over to individual differences. Why do we differ in how we respond to hormones? Why do we differ in prevalence of certain hormone-related diseases, abnormalities, things of that sort? And we've heard some examples already, some ways in which we have these differences. Little differences in testosterone levels probably won't do it. Little differences in some other hormones may be relevant. We would have no trouble now constructing some of these models. We're going to be different in how much hormone we make. We're going to be different in how much of it we dump in our bloodstream, how long it lasts there, how readily it's broken down, how readily it's delivered to the brain. The first half of the equation, we're obviously going to differ in how loud of an endocrine signal we produce. And you can bet there's all sorts of interesting diseases out there built around people who make the wrong amounts of hormones. Classical endocrine sort of diseases, diabetes, juvenile diabetes is such a case. You don't make enough insulin when you were a kid and you got problems. There's beginning to be recognized a variety of behavioral disorders that are probably built around incorrect hormone levels as well. That's a level we've got no trouble dealing with by now. The other half of it is one that people are just now beginning to assimilate. Half the equation is how loud you're shouting your message. The other half is how well the cells are listening, how many receptors there are there, and how well the receptors are working. And let me give you one absolutely wild example that shows this principle. It's not just how much hormone there is, it's how well you're listening to that hormone. This is a remarkable disease that puts everybody in the edge of their seat when they hear about this. Here's the scenario. You have a daughter, 10-year-old daughter, who's doing fine, life is great, she's happy, she's healthy, everything seems terrific. She gets to be 11, 12 years of age. Most of her friends are hitting puberty already. They're beginning to develop. They're getting their first periods. Your daughter has not yet. This is not a big deal. This is a little bit on the late side. She's 13, still not a big deal. Some kids just develop more slowly. It's nothing to get upset about. 14, 15, she still hasn't gotten her first period. And finally you decide, well, this is something you can't really ignore anymore. You're worrying that you're all sort of in denial. Take her to a physician. Take her to a physician saying, well, what's wrong here? Why isn't she getting periods yet? Why hasn't she hit puberty? And the physician examines her, and invariably at some point or other sort of gasps and takes a big breath and then tries to cover this up and sort of goes out and collects him or herself afterward and finally sits you down with some very interesting news, which is that your child is not having periods yet because your child is a boy. And this is a shocking observation. Your child is a boy. Your child genetically is a boy, X and Y chromosomes. Your child is a boy on the gonadal level. This individual has testes that are undescended, but testes in there, there's no ovaries anywhere around. Your child is a boy on an endocrine level. This individual has testosterone levels, not just normal levels, levels through the roof, incredibly elevated testosterone levels. This individual has everything going that is male with one problem. There's a mutation, a genetic defect, not in testosterone, but in the testosterone receptor. This individual has no testosterone receptors, and in the absence of testosterone receptors, you can secrete testosterone until it's coming out of your ears. It's not going to be doing anything whatsoever. And the biology of the system is people develop as females phenotypically in terms of how they appear unless there's a biological signal in the form of testosterone saying this one's going to have testes, this one's going to have a beard, this one's going to have secondary sexual characteristics typical of a male, this person looks female. And this is a disorder called testicular feminization syndrome, and it's absolutely wild stuff. These are genetic males. These are hormonal males, everything except the testosterone receptor is not there. And when you've got that going on, this person is going to look female. Obvious, interesting ethical question is, what do you do at this point? And I believe what most clinicians do is they don't sit these folks down and say, well, you got a boy on your hands, and it's time you came to terms with this. I think often what is done, and this strikes me as probably the most compassionate thing, and the logical thing is to just say, your daughter unfortunately is never going to be able to have children. There's something wrong there, but otherwise she's happy and healthy, and you should, be grateful that this is how life is. There's many ways that things could be worse, and nobody ever hears about the male part. And that's probably something worth debating over, the ethics of what you inform somebody or not. Biologically, this is fascinating. An even more bizarre version of this, showing you what these receptors are good for. This is a disease that's seen back in the hinterlands in the Dominican Republic, up in the mountains there, the sort of hint you would expect to see an inbred population back in an isolated village there. There's a disease there of some enzyme that processes testosterone and has something to do with how much testosterone gets presented to the testosterone receptor. In this case, it's not like testicular feminized individuals where they've got no receptor at all, a massive receptor defect. Here, the receptor is there, but the net result is there's not quite as much of a testosterone signal getting through. So what happens? When these individuals are kids, prepubescent, these males have low testosterone levels, nowhere near enough testosterone to have an effect on the receptors. How do these individuals look? They look female, just like the testicular feminization story. Around puberty, testosterone levels go up. They finally get high enough that enough of a testosterone signal gets through to those receptors, and these individuals change sex. And this is this wild thing. This has been seen in a number of inbred populations. I believe there's a case in New Guinea as well, and where it's slightly different endocrine features going wrong there. But the main point is, these people change sex at puberty. I mean, this is incredible. What's most incredible is the cultural adaptation. People in these populations have learned, every now and then this happens. I mean, just imagine something like that here. I mean, we're traumatized enough having pimples at puberty. That puts us with, analysts for years afterward. Imagine if you change sex. There it's recognized, this is how life is. Every now and then people change puberty. There's been this change sex at puberty. There's been this cultural adaptation in these areas. Very interesting interaction between a fluke of biology and culturally what's done with it. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to go from these extreme cases, receptors that don't work at all, receptors that work at only certain times of life, to take that leap that we've had throughout this course to look at the more subtle versions. Slight differences in numbers of receptors, in the amounts of hormones, slight differences in how well the receptors work, where they're distributed in the brain, and we're beginning to look at our individual differences. Not them and their weirdo endocrine disorders, but the things that make us us, this theme yet again. Okay. This brings us to the end of this lecture, and essentially what we have now, I think, are the building blocks we need. We have gone from the level of a single neuron up to regulations of vast parts of your body all at once, autonomic regulation, hormonal regulation, and closing the loop how these hormones in turn get back into your brain. This gives us everything we need for our first pass now in the final lecture to go back to some of those same disorders, those bizarre, unlikely things I introduced in the first moments of this course, and now to begin to understand them in a biological context, and to take the lessons of those bizarre disorders and extend them to us and our subtleties. And this will be the subject of the final lecture.